welcome to Power Word Podcast Episode 4. Today we're going to be talking about some of the 11.1 discipline changes coming with the new patch. We're getting a variety of changes that Blizzard has stated their goals, and we're going to talk about today whether or not we feel like those goals have been met, and if we feel like those goals make sense, because some people have expressed concern over them not really feeling like they're accomplishing much. So today we've got Smallpriest and Xaph with me, so say hi, guys.
Hey, hello.
Hello.
So yeah, let's dive right in. I don't think we need too much of an introduction here. We've done this a couple times now. So I think the first topic that I wanted to bring up prior to us kind of diving into these specific changes, what's changed, what the stated goals that Blizzard has tried to bring up in their blue post, I wanted to first start off with what do we feel like the problems are with Disc that need to be approached? How do we feel that Disc is performing in raids from tier to tier? What kind of issues we feel like there are with Disc going tier to tier? Disc's performance in M plus, with this specific season being Disc being heavily meta. Kind of how these, what changes and what issues we feel like there are in the design of the spec for M plus. Kind of just go over our thoughts on what needs to be looked at before we jump into what Blizzard thinks needs to be looked at.
Sure. Anyone want to go first, or can I just go in?
Yeah,
Go for it.
Go ahead.
I think it'll be brought up enough in the general conversation as well. Obviously, healer ecosystem, as in sharing a niche in raid specifically with other healers is a big problem. But I want to go into a different point first, which for me, a personal thing, having played Disc for 6 years now, I tend to think back to other versions that we've had and consider if I've enjoyed those more. And I think I have to admit, I do prefer it whenever the rotation specifically is not complicated. I think of all the times we've had complicated rotations, I think back into Dragonflight, where we've literally had 10 unique buttons followed in a specific order during your ramp to help with TE and everything. And to me, that was not a good time. But compare that to maybe BFA, where all you really had was Schism, Penance, Solace, and Smiting, which was extremely easy. I think I would always rather be on that side. And what we currently have, it's kind of a mixture of it, but specifically Oracle, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that hero tree later as well, feels kind of convoluted in ways where I can understand for a new player or for a lot of players that already think Disc in raids is already challenging to do the whole ramp thing as a concept. Having then to also figure out how to properly do the rotation can just be a complete buzzkill, especially when the output just isn't there in the end when you're actually doing the rotation properly.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the best example of convoluted rotations definitely has to be the 0.5 patch of Aberrus, right? I mean, we still had the active, the manual cast Scav, so there was a dead GCD in the middle of our burst just to activate Scav, because that was prior to the change of tying that to pet. We had the Rhapsody buff during that patch, so we had Rhapsody weaved in there, so there was a period of our rotation where we were running into melee range to hit Rhapsody as one of the TE activators. Like you said, I'm pretty sure during the Aberrus patch, I'm pretty sure we had more unique buttons in a single ramp than the vast majority of classes had in their entire rotation. That was a bit extreme. I think that was, definitely a for masochists spec version of the spec.
I did not play Discipline at all during Aberrus for the reasons that you outlined. I just felt like it was overly complicated, and the payoff was definitely not worth it. That patch compared to Holy, Vault of the Incarnates, I played a mix of Discipline and Holy depending on the boss, but I also felt that the rotation was definitely too cluttered, and I'm glad that they moved in a more simplifying direction for both end of Dragonflight and start of War Within. I personally enjoy the rotation a lot right now, even though it's still fairly complex with the pet and all that. But I agree with Small Priest that I've also played Discipline since its rework, in Legion, and I agree that I preferred it when it was simpler too, because I like when the complexity comes from planning the ramps and doing all your homework outside raid and like figuring out how to play around the movement requirements of the fight, stuff like that, without having to worry about pressing intricate 10 button sequences, like you said.
So you actually mentioned something in there that I really want to talk about, because you brought up the payoff not being there. And back when we got our rework in Legion, this kind of is a segue into the healer ecosystem problem, right? Back in Legion, when Disc first got its rework, we got a big rework at the beginning of Legion, and then another strong rework during 7.2.5, which is when we were given the charges and cooldown of radiance. Before that, we had no cooldown radiance, and the spec was kind of weird, where it was just fairly limited entirely by
That
mana.
was going into Tomb, right?
Correct. Yes, it was. It
Yeah.
was during Nighthold when we got the 7.2.5 change. Going into Tomb was the first tier of basically what I would consider modern Disc. So when we got those changes during 7.2.5, the healer ecosystem looked very different. Discipline was designed as a spec to kind of be this: you have a really short cooldown in an ecosystem where short cooldowns didn't exist. And you had a lot of this extra work to do and these big long setups and really timing specific setups. But the return was that you got to burst more often than any other healer in the game. Right? Back then, a lot of people don't even remember this because this was very short lived, but evangelism wasn't even a minute and a half. It was shorter than that. We had a very, very short cooldown compared to everybody else in the game. Most healers had, a single 3-minute cooldown. Druids had Trank. I don't remember which specific patch Flourish was added, but that wasn't like, they didn't have big Flourish ramps back then.
Flourish was like a combination of a spell and their artifact ability, I think. One of them gave them like Extend Hot and the other one doubled
That's
the
right.
tick rate.
Yep.
So
Yeah, so they had a 2-button sequence that was basically their evangelism, and I think it was a 90-second cooldown, so it was comparable to evangelism, just not as powerful, if I remember right.
yeah.
Yep, but we had, shamans had Tide and Link, Holy Priest. This Holy Priest got Salve at the end of that expansion, so for the majority of that expansion, they just had him as their primary cooldown. But basically, the number of cooldowns in the game was significantly less. So a lot of healing and a lot of fights. I'm not going to say that tools like, CD planning spreadsheets didn't exist. They did. They were still a thing. I distinctly remember using them and pre-planning all of that kind of stuff, but not to the not to the level that we have them now. In the article that we put up on Icy Veins, I put a screenshot of the Visario app with Ansorex CD planning. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, I hate that.
I don't know how you can look at that and be like, yeah, this is an approachable healer ecosystem design. This is how I want the game to be played. We have gone so far from being a good healer means good target selection, efficient casting, knowing when to expend your mana and when to not, how to play around your healer, your co-healers to kind of cover the dangerous moments, and a lot of those various skills, to prior to a fight begins, you import a bunch of CD plans from lorgs and from guides and from, other high top logs or whatever plan you get it from. You import that, you have this giant 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle of CDs on Visario app. You import it into the game, and then everybody's just sitting there hitting buttons as they glow when they tell them to hit CDs. That's kind of what we've evolved to. But because of the fact that healing has been so cooldown focused now, we have this issue where damage has ramped up accordingly. So now all of a sudden, there's so many cooldowns in the game, and there's so many cooldowns handling damage events, that every damage event that's being designed is based around being handled by a cooldown. There's not really a damage event happening in a fight where everybody's just like, sure, your shaman will throw a couple chain heals out, and your paladin will throw a couple holy shocks out, and you're good. No, it's just every damage event is covered by a cooldown.
And I think you can, like, if you go through it historically, you can very much tell power creep where, like, every patch or every half patch, it feels like something just got added. Like, it started with Holy Priest getting Salvation, which, okay, sure, maybe only having him was too little. Then we go into, I think BFA, not that much change. Maybe Mistweaver gained their Yulon or Chi-Ji during BFA already. I'm not sure. But then we go into Shadowlands, and suddenly we have Divine Toll and or Ashen Hollow added to Paladin. Shaman's got Red Chain Heal or whatever they had. Sure, this got a trade off with Spiritual mostly, but we did get Boon, for example, or Mind Games, which was a cooldown. Then Druids got Convoke, and what happened when the expansion was over? Well, half of these spells just got baked into the base kit, so everyone just got these on top, and then that expansion following that being Dragonflight, well, Evoker or Preservation Evoker is just a spec that has a lot of cooldowns, even if none of them might be like the singular best cooldown per se. They just have access to a lot of potential, with Stasis being very flexible, also going into Emerald Communion with big ramps with Lifebind. They have access to Rewind, which is probably one of the best single button presses you can have. They have Dreamflight, which is a fairly minor cooldown, but still something you usually end up assigning in these kind of things. And suddenly you just have, well, and then now they've gained Engulf with the Flame Shaper tree, for example. You just see patch by patch, it just gets stacked on top of top of top, and well, suddenly everyone has 5 cooldowns.
Yeah. And I think
I think even beyond healing, it's just an issue of like Blizzard's trying to continue to find new ways to innovate and add like fun new buttons for people to press, because that's what people expect from new expansions.
I can't even blame them for it, right? I agree,
Right.
It is fun. Whenever these new buttons come in, it is really cool. Like us getting uppies, like that's also part of it, even if it's not insanely powerful at some point, or it was insanely powerful at some point. It's another button added, and everyone just went, holy shit, great, a new button that looks cool, awesome. I love that. But
yeah, so I think it's just kind of a continuation of power creep across the board, and button creep for like not even just healers but DPS too, because we've come a long way from vanilla where everybody just presses their one button or two buttons. Like every expansion since then, it's not necessarily something brand new where they're continuing to add more and more, and like kind of struggling to figure out where they can take stuff away without feeling like a loss along the way. So now we're where we're at now with the Viserio spreadsheet, and I feel like people who have been healing for a while have kind of been eased into that mindset because we've been using spreadsheets and stuff for a while now, at least since Legion, if not longer. But now I feel like it would definitely be very hard for a new player to get into Mythic rating as a healer, because it's just so much that you have to learn right off the bat with stuff that the rest of us are already kind of used to at this point.
I mean, something that I often run into, I don't know if you guys do cooldowns for your guild as well, but I usually do them together with Tordi, and if I don't keep up with the other specs, I kind of feel bad at some points because I'm trying to assign all these cooldowns, but if I'm not up to date on all 7 healer specs, I'm not actually sure if they're like worth combining, if you want to use them on cooldown. Like Paladins for like 4 years straight have just pressed Wings on cooldown, but like, maybe it is worth holding it for 20 seconds at some point. I have no idea. And imagine going into that as a new player. How the hell are you going to learn all these 7 specs just to assign some cooldowns? It's quite a mess.
Yeah. So, before we go for too much longer on the general healer ecosystem rant, this is Powered Podcast. Let's turn it back towards discipline focused. How do all of these issues impact us as a spec from a design perspective? Because this is a very big challenge from a design perspective. Discipline back in Legion was designed in a very specific manner to be a short cooldown burst healer with drawbacks. Do you guys feel like over the years those drawbacks have been removed enough that since we've kind of lost the niche of being the spec with more cooldowns more often, with things like Preservation Evoker being added, do you feel the drawbacks have been pulled back enough to warrant still running Disc?
I'd say in general, no. Like if I have to say yes or no, then it's a no. But I do feel like in the current patch that we're in right now, it's in a pretty good spot. It's still not approachable for new players, and there's no real reason to play Disc Priest when you could play something else. But for me, somebody who enjoys Discipline Priest and plays it whenever it's fun and good, I've actually enjoyed this patch quite a bit, because I do still feel like, especially with things like Wheel and Woe into Void Blast, stuff like that kind of burst potential is still there. And so I feel like I do have kind of an edge on the other healers that I raid with, just purely from a design perspective at times. Like they definitely will catch up on HPS during the downtime when my healing is weaker. But for those burst moments, I do feel like the payoff is currently at least somewhat there. Maybe not the way it used to be, but I can still kind of carry a raid mechanic on my own with a well executed ramp. And that's what makes Disc fun to me and why it wasn't as fun in times like Vault of the Incarnates when a full ramp, it might have done good healing over like a 10-second period or whatever, but that like snap bursty feeling wasn't there where I could like see the health bars move up when I pressed my buttons kind of thing.
Yeah, I think for me, tiers where putting a lot of effort into Disc and having a well done moment, and it still turns out you're not even remotely competitive with the other healers, regardless of their gameplay. Realistically, if you're in a guild at your skill level, the other healers are going to be on a similar skill level as you. So I don't think it's fair to expect just because I might play a bit harder spec, or maybe a decent bit harder spec, doesn't matter. I don't think you should expect to be 20-30% ahead of others. I don't think that was a good time. Like, think back to Old Year or something for Disc. That was not a good time for the healer system either. It's not good when a spec, just because it's harder, that it's not supposed to be that far ahead. I'm fine, as Xaph said, right where it is right now, where if I play well, I can keep up. I can do most healing. I can be second. I can be third. It depends, just depends on the scenario and how the others play as well. But I can definitely compete, and I don't really feel bad about having to put in extra effort. Feel like you're putting in the effort and you can't compete, then it feels really bad. Like Avarice, for example.
Right.
A lot of it depends on how Holy specifically is doing as well, because obviously there's a lot less friction to reroll off of Discipline onto another class compared to like if Holy is significantly better and easier to play, then why wouldn't you play it kind of thing? And so we saw stuff like that in Shadowlands specifically with the flash concentration meta. Holy was just extremely powerful and it was hard to justify playing Discipline in that meta where now like Holy is definitely good and has its own niche, but it doesn't really like encroach on Disc's niche as much. So right now I feel like you can actually make a choice. Like, do I want to play Discipline or Holy? And since Discipline isn't played that much, like you might get a little pushback on it, but it's not as obvious of a dichotomy as it has been sometimes in the past.
Yeah, Holy's not what's creeping up to Disc's niche, luckily.
Yeah, they've remained fairly unique in regards to what they provide. I would almost say that the niche that Holy provides is much more unique than the niche that Disc provides at the moment, being kind of one of the only true spot healer focused classes in the game. There's other classes that can help spot heal a lot more than Disc, but Holy's definitely one of the only ones that really kind of leans into that niche.
Yep.
This last raid tier hasn't been nearly as bad for probably our favorite topic to talk about, the good old passenger princess problem. This tier hasn't been nearly as bad. I don't think there's been as many fights this tier where it's felt awful to be, like I can't do this fight without 17 rescues and a spell bop like something like Farrak was. Like doing P1 Farrak without some way of skipping one of the Rens was atrocious. Like it was doable, you could do it, but it was at a significant loss, and it didn't really feel like you had a lot of the tools capable of managing that part of the fight on your own.
Yep, agreed.
But despite this tier not feeling as bad, it's still a problem that's likely going to creep up depending on fight design. Something like Vault of the Incarnates was horrendous for this.
Razageth.
Razageth, trying to survive the Hurricane wing on Razageth. A lot of fights had damage all focused around right when we needed to be casting our radiances, and we had no mobility to be able to manage that, and a lot of disruptions. It's a problem that's going to continue to pop up based on fight design. Every time there's going to be a fight that involves heavy movement during our setup period, or it seems like there's a trend where Blizzard is slowly adding more and more damage or more movement around the damage mechanics. A lot of fights involve, you have to run from point A to point B while all of this damage is coming out. And Vault was definitely the worst, but it's still been present in a lot of these fights. do we feel like this is mostly just because of the timing sensitive nature of disc, or do we think it's more lack of burst mobility options where we don't have access to a displacement to kind of get us from point A to point B after finishing those radiance casts? Like, is it that we can't delay the radiance casts because of the timing nature of disc, or is it that we want to just be able to finish the radiance casts and then jump from point A to point B with a displacement, but we don't have access to?
I think I'd rather go with the first one. Like if we got Door of Shadows back from today to tomorrow, I don't think it would really solve many issues that I have on the fights where these problems creep up. I don't want to be casting Radiance and then or like 2 Radiances and then have to sprint twice the distance in half the time after that. That does not sound great either. I would rather have ways to play around that. And something else I want to say to the topic is I think I have 2 different things in my mind for this, where one of the issues that disc or priest in general sometimes I feel like has is where you can't deal with fight mechanics, and then the other one is where you can't heal because of the fight mechanics. Like Razagath, I'm not too sad that I can't heal during the pushbacks. I'm not too sad that I couldn't do infinite healing during. Okay, I'm kind of sad about Dathia, for example. That one was annoying, but specifically something that's come up more often recently is like the roots on Ansarek, where great, we have a root on 20 people, and out of those 20 people, 18 can get out by themselves. And it just feels a bit repetitive, where last year we had the same thing on Tindril, now we have the same thing on Ansarek. I'm tired of like mechanics targeting everyone in the raid, but 2/3 of the raid can just immune it or get out of it, and then you're just left as like the person that has to get help. Like I don't mind there being CC on the raid or mechanics that we have to deal with, and some people can immune it, but specifically these root mechanics are just kind of bothering me, honestly. And Razagath, I would throw in a similar thing where half the specs could deal with the movement, the pushback, but then there's just some that just can't do anything about it at all. Like what you could walk on the first pushback and that was it. After every single one after that, you had to either gate or get rescued. That's way too much. So that's really bothering me. And then yeah, I think there's an increase of damage and movement overlaps, and on some of them it's fine, on some of them it's not. I'm okay if it's only sometimes. It depends. Sometimes it's really bad, sometimes it's fine. I don't think you should have a tool to deal with every move.
I agree. It kind of feels like luck of the draw every tier, like whether the boss design is going to like present us with a boss that has issues that are just not able to be overcome by a priest, or a tier like this one where like there might be a thing here or there that is biased against priests, but like Ansarek, for example, I feel like is more solvable than most problems. Like I personally had a blessing of freedom from a Ret Paladin, as I'm sure many of us did, and so I didn't really have to think about that as much since we had it solved. But like a Farok scenario is much more bothersome to me, where we need that spatial paradox, especially now that it's a choice node with time spiral. And there's a lot of people who will frown at you if you ask them to spec into spatial instead of time spiral, because time spiral helps everybody except the priest. And then the spatial helps the priest, but nobody else. So it's like
That's actually a good
it's
point. It doesn't even help the priest.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
just this awkward choice that they now have to make, where like I'm afraid to speak up and say, hey, can I get a spatial here? Because I know like our elemental shaman, for example, really relies on time spiral to pump damage because they get Spirit Walker's Grace, which is an amazing cooldown. Whereas like I'm like, I really wish I could cast spells while moving here, but I just can't,
Yeah.
because it's more valuable to the raid as a whole if it benefits everybody else except me. But I think Ansarek, apart from the root issue, was a good example of where like the movement happened at the time when you wanted to ramp, but it wasn't impossible to do. Like with practice, you can get your ramp down, you can get good at watching where the waves and the web blades are coming from. You can plant your feet and cast your radiances, and you might lose a GCD or two here or there if you get unlucky. But for the most part, you're able to still get your ramp off despite the hurdles being thrown at you. And it doesn't feel impossible, and it feels rewarding when you get it right. So that's the kind of fight design that I appreciate, where it definitely doesn't let you just stand still the entire fight, but at the same time, it doesn't make it feel impossible to execute your rotation either.
Yep. Agree.
Okay. I don't know if we want to talk about the healer ecosystem and passage process stuff too much more here. I feel like we've kind of covered that. It's pretty fight dependent. It's going to be pretty tier dependent. There's going to be tiers where it's going to be awful. There's going to be tiers where it's kind of better, like this tier. But we'll see what happens in the future.
We just hope for the better tiers.
Yep. So diving into our next choice of topic here. I want to talk about the sections of the Blue Post specifically where Blizzard is attempting to define what they're attempting to do. We don't get much. They don't give us these giant, articles or these giant paragraphs saying, here's what we're trying to accomplish and here's how we're going to do it. We get very little. So, with that very little that we were given, let's try to figure out what Blizzard's trying to accomplish. And then after we try to figure out what Blizzard's trying to accomplish, do we think that they met that, or do we think they missed the mark?
Do you want to read the Blue Post thingy out again?
Yeah, sure. So right at the top of the Blue Post, they go into the discipline section, and they start off by stating, the goal of these changes is to reduce the number of cooldowns Discipline has access to and bake some of that power into other abilities. In addition, we're resolving some pain points in the talent tree and making it easier to quickly get atonements on allies by moving Overloaded with Light into a more central location. Finally, we're retheming Purge the Wicked into a shadow spell so that Twilight Equilibrium can be more consistently activated. So let's kind of break that down into each line first, right? So they start off by stating that they're attempting to reduce the number of cooldowns Discipline has access to and bake that power into the baseline spec.
Oh, you cut off for a second there, by the way.
Oh, okay. They've stated that they're trying to reduce the number of cooldowns Discipline has access to and bake some of that power into the baseline spec. Do we feel like that is a valid goal? And do we feel like the changes that they made met that goal or completely missed the mark?
Right. So taking a step back, it's about reducing the amount of like spikes you have due to cooldowns and having it be more equal, which is generally not something that I would say is what Disc has usually had. Especially like from a principle point, it's been very much about cooldowns and very little outside of that, but they want to pull back a bit on this. The only changes we've really seen them do about this is removing Rapture, removing Heaven's Wrath, which was the cooldown reduction on uppies. And I think that's basically it for, I guess you could say having Void Summoner give less CDR means you're also getting less pets and thus less cooldowns, but I think those three are the main things. And I think at this point, the power that they have put back into other abilities doesn't really feel better in any way. It feels a bit lame, I think. Specifically, like going through each of them, Rapture got removed, and instead Power Word Shield is now slightly stronger. I don't really think this makes a difference. I don't think anyone has ever, like specifically in raid scenario, I don't think I've ever heard a single person talk about Rapture in a way like, wow, that was crazy. We just had Rapture here, and we just saved so many people. It was never that impactful. No one ever looked at Rapture and was like, this is too strong in raids. And in dungeons, it helped fill a problem that Disc has, specifically with like single target or extended single target healing, especially with the changes we got for the War Within, that we just kind of have no response to now, because while Power Shield is a bit stronger than it was before, it still has a long cooldown. It still has a cooldown, and Train of Thought also got removed, so that cooldown is not changing. Uppies has a longer cooldown now, but has Overloaded with Light always. That's just how it is, I guess. And Pet being changed, there was no real buff to pets. Pet are just up slightly less often, and that's really it.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would say I don't really agree with the stated goal either, because I feel like discipline is meant to be a cooldown healer. Like, not necessarily you're pressing a big flashy button, but the way discipline works at its core is that you apply atonements, which takes a while, and you're not doing much healing while you're applying atonements, and then you burst. And your really biggest limiter is your power word radiance charges. And so like evangelism and rapture and these things are all, supplements to that, and they enable us to burst for more and longer, perhaps. But like the core of it is just the cycle between applying atonements and then bursting when you're done applying them. And that part of it, I feel, is what makes discipline fun and unique. And so I feel like what they're trying to do with like removing rapture and stuff, it feels very random to me, and it doesn't really address what they say they're doing, nor does it feel like a positive change. Like rapture in particular, like Small said, it's not really a big deal in raid. No, nobody's gonna miss it that much for the power that it provides. But at the same time, it's a very iconic discipline ability, in my opinion, and it's been around for quite a while. So it just feels strange to kind of remove it out of nowhere for reasons that don't really make sense to most of us, I would say.
I think if you had the exact first sentence, but it didn't say discipline and just said healers, I would have been like, hell yeah, this makes sense. We have way too many cooldowns, but then Disc is the only one to get cooldowns removed. I'm like, I thought Disc was supposed to be the healer with cooldowns. And why did you got Rapture out of all the cooldowns? Like, this changes absolutely like nothing for the healer ecosystem. And I mean, for Disc, it's just a numbers game at that point.
Do you think this could be mainly, from Blizzard's perspective, an accessibility thing? Because as somebody, that has helped a lot of people in keys, one of the biggest issues that people consistently, one of the biggest issues I see in logs when I look at people's logs, when they come to me and they say, help, I don't know how to handle this, help, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I look at their logs and they're sitting on cooldowns way too long. And the way that the spec is designed is we have very little power outside of our cooldowns, so we have a ton of power in our cooldowns. So consistently using our cooldowns often, but in a way where you don't end up finding yourself in a situation where you have nothing available for a specific moment, is one of the most critical skills for Disc and keys, right? You can't sit on your pet, you can't sit on your cooldowns, you have to use them. But if you use them too much, you're screwed. Do you think that this is a change from an accessibility point of view of we want to put more power into the base kit and remove power from cooldowns so that it's less punishing and more approachable for new players that don't quite understand how they need to use all of these cooldowns perfectly yet?
I think if the dungeons also support that, I could see it. But I'm gonna hold back on assuming that being the case. Because if the fight mechanics, specifically about dungeons, right? The fight mechanics require cooldowns, then they require cooldowns. And again, before we had Rapture giving you multiple powered shields in a row that are extremely empowered, and now we have powered shield on the cooldown that is just its cooldown and it's slightly stronger. If you can't deal with the damage that's coming in because you don't have a cooldown for it, then there's absolutely nothing you can do anymore. That's just how it is. There's no going up from that anymore. And I'm not sure if the dungeons will play into that, where you're more consistent but have less cooldowns.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I feel like discipline in keys definitely lives and dies by the pet and the entropic rift, both of which are taking a nerf. And so I feel like if we continue to see dungeons where there's a lot of AoE damage going out on the party and you really can't handle it without those cooldowns to carry you through it, then it probably will be problematic for Disc. Maybe not at the the vault key level, but definitely higher than that. I could see Disc falling out of the meta because it's very binary. I feel like discipline keys. It's like, is your atonement enough to handle the damage or is it not? Like there's really no other tuning knob. I feel like it's very yes or no. Like is atonement enough for this or is it not? And if the answer is that it's not, there's really not that much you can do about it most of the time. Apart from like you can definitely leverage power word barrier. You used to be able to leverage rapture, things like that to kind of augment or like postpone until you can get to your next burst. But yeah, I don't see it really working out that well in this case.
think it's something we've often talked about before, Clannon, right? Where we take Druid as an example, Resto Druid, where you can fine tune your AoE healing pretty well due to how their mastery works, and being able to just not only the mastery, but also just being able to decide how many hots you want to have on a specific person bar. But for Disc, it's just completely binary, right? You have Atonement out, and then you do your DPS rotation. Sure, you can tune the DPS rotation, but with how low the cooldown is, why wouldn't you use Pet and Rift together? And if that's enough, then it's enough. And if it's not enough, then, well, shit. Hopefully they have a defensive.
Right. Okay. So we'll see what happens with the removal of Rapture, but moving on to the next point. They mention resolving some pain points in the talent tree, specifically by moving Overloaded Light to a more central location. So specifically, that's moving moving Uppies to below Indemnity in a center location, and then putting Overloaded with Light directly below that, also in a center location. So this primarily makes Uppies significantly easier to get because it's out of the capstone region. So you're no longer having Uppies itself as a baseline spell competing with things like Harsh Discipline and Void Summoner and Inescapable Torment and Wheel and Woe and stuff like that, because those are all very high value talent points. So it makes Uppies easier to get. And then Overloaded with Light is now just a single point that you can spend in the capstone section to basically give you an additional raid ramp in, one talent point. Whereas previously you were having to pick up Uppies and Overloaded with Light as separate points, plus the point for Heaven's Wrath, etc. Do we feel like this is a significant benefit to the spec? Do we feel like it's easier from a accessibility perspective? Do we feel like it just doesn't change much? It kind of simplifies and streamlines build diversity? Because previously in this tier, we had multiple builds where we had the standard, I want to focus heavily on abusing Void Wraith, and, the fight has a 30-second damage cadence, so I'm just going to push 30-second pet, double rad pet, and just go. And then we had fights like Ovanax and Kaiveza, where we wanted to play less around the pet, still heavily around the pet, but less around the pet, because we had some back-to-back damage events that we wanted to cover where we wanted to abuse Uppies ramps. Now you kind of just get Uppies more for free in the builds, so you're just kind of going to have a singular build that includes both at all times, because the opportunity cost to get it is much less. Do we like that? Or did we like the build diversity more?
You want to go first, Seth?
Sure. So personally, I love Uppies Ultimate Penitence. I think it's a really cool, flashy spell. So I'm certainly happy to have it be more accessible, because I personally enjoy when a fight fits the spell and I get to use it to its full effect. I really liked Ovanax and Kaiveza this tier for that reason. I felt like because of Uppies, full Uppies, I was able to cover more than I would have been able to without it. And so it felt really good, especially for Kaiveza, because it also kind of canceled the pull into the center, which, it didn't really matter, but it still just felt cool that you're kind of like rising into the air and forcing everybody else to look at you while you do your ramp. It felt like I'm the main character kind of moment. So just like from a fantasy perspective, I really like the spell and I like that we get to use it more. But I definitely agree with the feedback that you've raised, that like the fact that Heaven's Wrath is no longer there means we're just stuck with it at a 4-minute cooldown. And so for fights where it doesn't necessarily do that much for you, especially if we continue to run Void Weaver, where you don't really want to, like it's kind of this awkward competition between, do I want to use Uppies here, which is a purely holy spell, or do I want to go into my Void Weaver rotation and cast my shadow spells? The two don't really go together unless it's a back-to-back damage event like you were talking about, where you simply don't have the cooldowns available to handle it otherwise. So all that to say, I think it's going in a good direction with it being more available, but I also agree that 4-minute cooldown definitely is a problem on most fights. So we'll just have to kind of see how it fits into new fight design if they choose to leave it that way.
Do you feel the power of the current spell warrants a 4-minute cooldown comparative to other healers' cooldowns on their output?
No, I mean, really, as far as I can think, the only comparison point of a cooldown that's longer than 3 minutes is Holy Word Salvation, which also just got removed. So I think Uppies will be the longest cooldown healer ability, won't it? Like, so
I
it
think
definitely doesn't feel like it merits that because it's not even a spell that always fits the fight and something you're always excited to press. Like, it really depends on the fight. And so, with that in mind, I don't think the 4 minute cooldown is justified.
Rewind is 4 minutes unless you spec into it, right?
Yeah, it's 4 minutes baseline, but
You
like
basically
almost
always
all of the
take
time
that.
you spec to make
Yeah.
it 3 minutes.
Yeah, that's true. I think 4 minutes specifically, I think is also kind of a bad time or like cooldown for a spell in WoW raiding, in the way that you have. I feel like you have kind of two types of fights. They're either like 6 to 7 minutes, or then you have these really long ones that are 8 to like 12 minutes even. And if you look at a 4 minute cooldown, well, in a 6 minute or 7 minute fight, there's only two uses, and if you can't use it, like if a fight is even shorter than that, like 5 minutes, you have to push it early on, or you just have to accept that you're only getting one singular use in the fight. It feels kind of awkward, I think. Um, it does not feel like a rotational cooldown at all anymore at that point. And for these longer fights, like 4 minute, just with such a long cooldown, you're always thinking, okay, can I get an extra use in? And then you start putting it at suboptimal times. With uppies at 2.5 minutes, I didn't really worry if I can get one extra use in a 7 minute fight. Like it doesn't matter as much if I'm getting 5 or 4 uses as it does if I'm getting 3 or 2 uses. So I think that for one feels kind of awkward. And for the general tree structure, on one hand, I want to say we've had something that we've called the Great Wall of 2 pointers for a while in the disc tree, which was basically that like a lot of talents after the first row were just 2 pointers, and it was really expensive to get down to our capstones, which they have went away with quite a bit in the way that there's more connections, or they're just going across, and some of them are also just 1 pointers. But now I feel like we have very little nodes we actually kind of want to pick, because looking at it from a ratings perspective, right? You have castigation, which is a given. You always take castigation. It's a good point. You always take overloaded with light. It's because it's for 1 point overloaded light with light is fantastic. Lenience is also incredibly strong. You always take that. Then you have your pet tree, which is Void Summoner is necessary to do anything with Scoff. IT is worth it, and Mindbender is just dependent on the fight, so that's another 2 to 3 points you're spending. Harsh Discipline is a pretty good value point, and Wheel and Woe gets a lot of value from Harsh Discipline, specifically as both now, because Oracle has Twin Sight and Void Weaver has Void Bolt that really leverages Wheel and Woe. So now you've spent 8 or 9 points out of your 10, and you have really picked nothing of flavor, I want to say. Like, you haven't picked a build, you've just picked talents that give you healing, and everything that's left is just a numeric question. If we're looking at how much healing or how much of our atonement healing is penance and smite, maybe Blaze of Light is good. If they actually fixed or made expiation good again, maybe that could numerically compete, but it doesn't really change anything. If we could somehow proc TE, maybe TE would be worth numerically. And same thing for inner focus, which we could go for now. If that was numerically good, we would go for it, but it doesn't really ever change anything gameplay wise. These talents that are left over are just percentage increases. None of them change anything. So really, it feels like all we've went from last patch to now is we always have uppies, but it's 4 minute cooldown. We always have lenience, and we have like one more point spare, but the talents aren't really all that interesting. They don't really change anything. Like that 1 point, we might as well spend it on like anything in the top of the tree. Doesn't matter. Taking one blaze of light or taking dot extension or painful punishment, it's not really that impactful. It's never going to make a difference in a. So on one hand, I want to say, yeah, they broke down the wall of 2 pointers, but on the other hand, it's gone and it doesn't make a difference now anymore.
Yeah, I think if there's any build diversity next patch, it'll come with Voidweaver versus Oracle, which obviously there's still more needed there to make them truly competitive.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's kind of what they're focusing on is they want Oracle to be picked sometimes at least, where now it's not picked at all. So I feel like the discipline talent tree, the build diversity there, it would be nice if it existed, but it doesn't really bother me if it's more cookie cutter. I'm more interested in how the spec plays as a whole than I am with being able to choose multiple builds. Like it's nice when it exists. Like I think Holy Priest is a great example of this, where they do have multiple builds and like to some degree the community doesn't even 100% agree on which talents are best because they're so close. So I think that's a great thing for a spec like Holy Priest, where it's a lot more freeform with how it plays. But for Disc, I feel like the rotation is such a core part of what makes the spec good and enjoyable that I almost don't want them to mess with it too much in the form of different talent builds. So as long as the end result is fun to play, then I'm happy even if the talent choices are limited.
That's fair. Yeah. I think I would agree in the end. Yeah. I don't have to change every talents every fight. I agree.
In particular, I am begging Blizzard, do not buff expiation. I do not want to play with expiation. To a lesser degree, same thing goes for Twilight Equilibrium. I can live with it if it's meta, but I really, really do not like expiation. So I hope they leave that alone.
You don't like constantly reapplying your dot all the time?
Oh, we'll get to it. Don't worry. We'll
Especially if
get
we're
to
stuck with the shorter duration of Shadow Word Pain, that would be such a nightmare to deal with.
Well, that's a perfect segue. Let's talk about the dot. So the last line that they mention here, we'll talk about this line first, and then we'll talk about the dot in a bigger grand scheme. They rethemed Purge the Wicked into a shadow spell. Basically, they deleted Purge the Wicked, and we now just have Shadow Word Pain.
But it can spread if you spec into it.
But you can spec into it to spread it like Purge the Wicked, yeah.
Yep.
So their stated reasoning is that so Twilight Equilibrium can be more consistently activated. Personally, I don't understand their reasoning stated at all. It doesn't really make sense at all to me. Because right now, assuming you're playing Voidweaver, Oracle's slightly different. Assuming you're playing Voidweaver, the issue we have is everything's shadow. Dark Reprimand is shadow. Void Blast is shadow. Like, the issue isn't that we didn't have enough shadow spells. We don't have enough strong holy spells.
No, we don't have holy spells. It's genuinely what it's Holy
Nova.
Nova. We have Holy Nova as a holy spell during Shadow Covenant and Entropic Rift. That's it.
Yeah, and that kind of gets back to Dragonflight when we did run TE and we had the powerful Holy Nova, we had Light's Wrath, and then we had Purge the Wicked to kind of activate that holy side of the equation, and Smite, obviously, too. But yeah, they've moved away from that enough that now it feels very random and definitely doesn't fit their stated goal, nor does it make me want to play Twilight Equilibrium.
Yeah.
You also don't, like, when you're in the middle of your burst sequence, I've never stated, words that have never left my mouth are, I'm in the middle of my burst window, people are dying, I need to optimize my output. You know what I really want to do right now? Refresh my fucking dot. That's never, like, Purge the Wicked or now just Shadow Word Pain isn't something I want to be a primary TE activator. For a TE to be good, we need actual relevant damage spells that we want to be pressing during our burst window to be able to cycle between the two variations of TE. We don't want dot refreshing to be how we activate it.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah,
and just for clarification, since we've talked about Voidweaver, for Oracle, where it can work more, if we're playing TE on Oracle, it's not because you can amp your dot. The dot is not there where it's worth, and like the dot is not strong enough, as Clan said, to press it during your burst window. And if you're amping it beforehand, yeah, maybe, but like it's going to be on accident. It's not going to be on purpose. You're not going to press Shadow Word Death to amp your Shadow Word Pain. Or actually, you have to press it the other way. It's Shadow now, so you're not going to intentionally buff your Shadow Word Pain. It's just going to happen because you did smite before. But that's really it. Oracle in general can just leverage TE more because it has Smite.
Now, I will say, despite the stated goal of Purge the Wicked somehow being Shadow now is the savior of TE, despite that making no sense, I do think them going to Shadowward Pain by default is a fine change. This is something we brought up multiple times, is that, you know, Purge the Wicked doesn't need to be all these additional points in the tree that you have to spend. We've even started looking at talent builds for the next patch where we are looking at, like, oh, well, if this is a single target scenario, we don't need to spend points on those anymore because they don't do anything. They've pushed the niche of those Purge the Wicked points from you have to take these because they're just a straight increase to our dot to these can now be taken when they make sense, which I think is good design. The problem comes from the fact that they didn't look at it from why are they taking Purge the Wicked. We weren't necessarily taking Purge the Wicked because holy crap, it's so much better than Shadowward Pain. In some situations, Shadowward Pain was outperforming because it's Shadow and Xaph was amping it.
And Abyssal Reverie.
And Abyssal Reverie, yeah. The primary reason why we were taking Purge the Wicked for all these years is because of the damn dot duration. The implications of the shorter dot in raid cast sequences is a nightmare.
Yeah, it's awful.
It causes so many problems. It's not even funny. We were simply taking Purge the Wicked for this many years because for some reason Purge the Wicked is a longer duration, so you can fully apply it to its full pandemic value prior to a ramp rotation and have it last through the entire ramp. You can't do that anymore. What is it now? It's a 21-second full duration, 20-second full duration with Shadowward Pain? 20 seconds, right?
It is 21 when you have pandemic, or 20.8 with
20.8,
pandemic.
yeah.
Yep.
They need to just give us the longer duration.
Like, I just to emphasize it, because you also played it yesterday in raid testing, right? I don't want to pat myself on the shoulder with this, because what I do usually is I just have a weak aura that has, I don't know, it's just like a red line above my character that reminds me to refresh the dot when it's in pandemic. And I've had this for years, and it's just kind of hard coded into my head when I see this that I try to refresh it. And you can't imagine the annoyance I've had when it felt so off constantly having to refresh your dot. It was like I'm going insane. I'm like, I just refreshed it. How is it gone already? Like, I swear it was 2 GCDs ago. It didn't make any sense. Like, it's all because of this whole muscle memory, and like it's not uncommon on any raid fights that I check currently on live that I have at least 98% uptime of the dot on anything. It doesn't drop. I'm used to it. That's just how it goes. It's not that difficult. But like, I don't even want to look at some of these fights yesterday, because there's genuinely situations where I'm running around with like 85%. I've never in years had this little uptime on the dot because it just feels so awkward. And rightfully so, because if it, you refresh it at the start of your dot, of your ramp, and if you don't, it's gonna fall off at some point, and it's not worth refreshing. It's not worth refreshing once you're in your ramp. You're just not gonna do it. It doesn't do enough damage for that. And I think that's just kind of, I don't know, kind of hate it.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and I would add, for me personally, I do not like losing Purge the Wicked. I think of it as an iconic disc ability, kind of like Rapture, even if the power wasn't necessarily off the charts. Just the fact that it's a different spell from what Holy and Shadow have, and it's kind of somewhere in the middle, like that's exactly what disc is supposed to be, in my opinion. So the fact that we now have the same dot that both Holy and Shadow have access to, it feels to me like a loss. Like there's no other way to put it. Even if they do buff the duration to make it so Shadowward Pain is effectively as good as Purge the Wicked was or better, I still feel like it was more fun to press Purge the Wicked and see that animation on my screen versus Shadowward Pain. So I don't really understand why they're doing this, and I feel like obviously it doesn't even fit the goal of pruning the class or making it simpler, because it's the same button anyway. So I don't get it. I don't like this change.
No, that's fair. I think we've talked about like it before it felt like Purge the Wicked was just a straight upgrade to Shadow Word Pain, where we felt like it could just be an alternative. Like it would have been fine if you pick Shadow Word Pain for single target and Purge the Wicked for spread, because that's kind of the thing with Purge the Wicked, it can spread. But for that, we said, okay, but for that to happen, you have to equalize the dot duration. And now they just removed Purge the Wicked and didn't equalize the dot duration yet. So now we're just kind of left with one awkward spell, and that's all.
Yeah. Okay, before we continue down the line of what's really bad and needs to be addressed, because we do have a section later that I want to talk about what needs to change after these changes, and this was one of the ones that I wanted to talk about. Let's kind of re-gear to, they've made some changes in these notes that are overall fairly positive. So I want to talk about the positives. What good changes did they make in these blue posts that we're happy about?
I mean, I think some of the talents they've given us are cool. I'm personally a fan of Divine Procession. I think it's nice. It's a decent node. I think similar to like Sanctuary. I think just attaching some power to Smite, but like not crucial power to Smite, because it goes hand in hand with the change to Void Summoner, where before we were spamming Smite because you kind of had to, like spamming Smite your filler to get more value on your next ramp felt very weird, but spamming Smite because it's slightly more efficient, because like Sanctuary you put an Absorb, a small one, or you extend a few atonements, makes it feel pretty nice, and it's an effect we've had before, so we liked it back then as well. I like it now, although would still love to see it be lowest atonement duration instead of a random one, just to make it a bit more consistent.
And that allows you to actually play around it too, right? Like, you can make
Yeah.
intentional gameplay decisions if it's lowest atonement, whereas right now with random,
Yeah,
it's still good
I mean,
value. It's still a good talent. You're still gonna have, like, it's still gonna be a very, very good point to take, but it becomes much more of a passive point.
yeah, I mean the clear example, right, is we're considering, for those that have played Disc in season 1, in dungeons you usually go Pet, then your Mind Blast, and then your Radiances, because that way your Entropic Rift actually explodes within your Radiance atonement window. Well, if you change it to Pet, Radiance, and then Mind Blast, you only need to hit Divine Procession on an atonement once, and it lasts into that rift. So that's an option, but now you run into a scenario where you're smiting like 6 to 7 times in that rift, and you need to hit ideally every atonement once. It's okay if the tank doesn't get it, but you could just have a scenario where you extend the tank 3 times and another person 3 times, and that's just it. The other 3 just don't get an extension and they run out before the rift explodes. So I don't know. I could also see people coming back and being like, yo, this is inconsistent as hell. I'm not going to do this anymore. Feels kind of frustrating.
Yeah, it becomes a situation where you can't plan around it. You can't make these cast sequence changes based around it because it's not reliable. So
Yep.
you play assuming you're not going to get anything, and then if it does work, cool, you get a little bit of added benefit. It's still strong, it's still nice, but you're not making these intentional gameplay decisions based around it.
Yep.
Yeah, I could definitely see it ending up as one of those things that looks really nice on paper, but in effect it doesn't actually do that much. That being said, like I really like the idea too of having my smites do something other than just for filler damage during downtime or whatever. I like the idea that they are doing little passive extra effects on top of that, but not reducing my pet like Smallpriest said. So I think it's a positive change, but I also think there should be some logic to which atonement it chooses. Like even if it's not always the lowest one, like if they think that's too powerful, then that's fair, whatever. But there should be some logic behind it. Like it shouldn't be choosing the same person over and over. It shouldn't be possible to do that.
Yeah, maybe it should just like at least not pick the target it had before, or one of the 2 targets it had before. Something like that.
Yeah, like maybe it's random, but it cycles through every person before repeating any individual person, or it could even be health based too, like lowest health, it boosts their
Yeah.
atonement. I don't know, that could do something, it could not, but at least it would be more chance of doing something than being truly random.
We probably had the same conversation when the tier set came in last expansion, where we were like, oh, is this the lowest atonement or a random one? And at that point, I was okay with it being random because because of the double smite, we had twice as many hits of it basically. So it was much less likely to happen that you don't extend everyone in a dungeon, for example, regularly often. But they have shown that we have the tech to extend the lowest atonement. We literally have a talent that does exactly that. Which would be nice if we could just reuse it at that point. If it's too strong, make it 1.5 seconds, make it 2 seconds. I don't know, figure it out.
Yep, agreed.
Another thing I think we would probably mention, evangelism changes. Evangelism does something on cast now. It heals. After having played with it a bit, I think I'm more excited about the animation than the actual healing it does. It now
You're not
shoots
wrong.
out like little white bolts. They look a bit like Penance, but not really. They're just pure white. But it looks pretty cool when you have a lot of atonements out. So that's the thing I'm most excited about. After having played it. Before I thought, well, in theory, there's some interesting stuff you can do, but
Yeah, so I will say, like, to be fair,
Yeah.
the animation on 20 does look very, very cool. To be
Yeah.
fair, though, from a design perspective, I do think it's a fairly elegant idea, and the purpose of the way that it works is that so it isn't very impactful in raid, right? The from a new edition perspective, not the whole spell. Obviously, the whole spell is supposed to be impactful in raid. The heal portion of it shouldn't be impactful in raid. The idea is that you still want to use the spell the same way we have before, as primarily an atonement extension button in raid. But the way they've implemented the heal being a split amongst all targets with atonement makes it so that it becomes a viable button in keys, which previously it had almost no value. Radiance was a very short cooldown, could apply atonement to the whole group. Having this 6-second extension on evangelism in keys was not something that provided any value. You didn't take it, you just ran lenience instead. Now you are going to have it because it's in a very accessible location of the tree, and they added some value to the button for M+. I think the design is great in theory. After I've gotten to play with it in practice, I've done the new dungeon a handful of times. I've done it a couple times to test Voidweaver and Oracle, and just experience the dungeon a few times. I was doing a couple 10s on the PTR. It feels bad to use because, and this is somebody coming from somebody that was very positive about this change prior. The biggest issue that I have is they either need to amp the heal to make it feel like an impactful 5-man heal, or they need to give us the ability to control where that healing goes in a way that isn't tied to atonement uptime. And it was bad enough on Voidweaver. It was even worse on Oracle because Oracle has longer duration atonements. It's not reasonable. There's situations where I want to go, this one person needs a big spot heal, or these 2 people need a large chunk of healing, and I want to use my evangelism heal on them. It's not reasonable to drop atonement from everybody in the group to try to focus that healing into those 1 or 2 people.
If you could even do that, like if there were like cancel aura macros or something involved, it's already bad. But like besides that, you don't even have the option to get rid of the atonement. Like you can't just let them run out. You can't manually remove them, and in a lot of scenarios, you can't have them run out because you just had them.
Yeah, or like I'm in the middle of trying to heal through other stuff to the point where like if we're looking
there's
at a
no way of
situation,
gaming it.
Yeah, if we're looking at a situation where there's passive AoE damage going out, but then one person also has a dot, that situation happens pretty frequently, where there's general levels of damage, but then one person's getting hit a lot harder. I can't just stop healing the whole group just to focus my evangelism healing into that one person.
Yep.
So there either needs to be additional design around the implementation of how the heal works so that I don't need to be trying to drop atonement from people to focus that healing into a single person, or it just needs to be buffed so I don't feel bad hitting it on 5 people, because right now pressing that button into 5, it doesn't feel impactful enough.
Yep.
It's a heal, but it's not like a holy crap that was a 1.5-minute cooldown heal.
I think it could just do with a bit of a touch up for how much healing it does. maybe have it actually work similar to other healing cooldowns now, where it does healing, or like it doesn't split healing onto people that are already topped or would get topped earlier from this. And also to keep in mind, it is bugged at the moment. It doesn't work with mastery, so you're looking at it at least missing like a 30% amp.
True.
Yeah, I personally really like this change overall, tuning aside. I think that, going back in history to BFA, they removed a lot, or they put a lot of spells on the global cooldown. Evangelism was already on it anyway, but a lot of spells got added to the global cooldown, and that was very poorly received by the community. So since then, they've been kind of trying to add back more effects to spells that make it so the GCD, when you're pressing them, yes, it's still a GCD, but it does something when it's activated, even if it's not something huge. But like, for example, Ascendance for Shaman, it does a burst of healing when you press it. It's not amazing, but at least it's doing something. So like, even if the initial heal from Evangelism kind of stays in that spot where it's not gonna be worth playing around that much, but it's just kind of there, it still makes me happy to know that the GCD is doing something apart from extending the atonements. And like Small said, I'm also a huge fan of them adding an animation to it, because for a long time I felt like, for it being kind of our core cooldown, like the thing that's supposed to feel the best to press, like it just looks like nothing.
Yeah,
So
all it did was trigger like the atonement glow around people, which you have those anyway.
yeah, and like
They got a
I
small
think
pair
it
of
it
wings
added
for
like
regrades,
little
I
wings
think.
on the back kind of too, like a very
Got the
brief.
wing.
Yeah, but it was basically like it had no animation. It was so hard to notice. So it reminds me of Light's Wrath, where it would kind of like draw in light from each person who had atonement while you were casting it. So I really like that idea that there's a visual connection between you and the people who have atonement. So
No, I
big
didn't
big
actually
props on
know that
that.
about Light's Wrath.
Well,
Really?
it was
I
hard.
love
It
that
was
part of
hard to
Light's Wrath.
notice back when it was like really fast cast time, but when it was like a slow wind up, I thought it was pretty noticeable.
I guess I have my eyes glued to the raid frame or something. I'd never noticed it does that.
It was kind of subtle, but I really liked it. I feel like that visual between you and each atonement is cool. So
Yeah, makes sense.
So other positives, um, they killed the Smite CDR gameplay.
Yes,
There's going to
correct.
be some people that are not 100% happy with the end result, because there are some interesting decisions like Train of Thought kind of getting shot down as a result. Blizzard kind of said, okay, we get it. You don't want any connection between pressing Smite and getting lower pet cooldown. And they made the link of, well, you can press Smite to lower Penance, which lowers pet. Therefore, they just killed that. So some people aren't happy about that, which we'll talk about Train of Thought in a little bit. But they did at least kill pet cooldown, which is something that a lot of people have been, or Smite resulting in pet cooldown, which is something a lot of people have been complaining about. Do you guys feel like the way they did this and the end result is enough, or do we think that we've kind of landed on a half-ass solution?
I actually think it's kind of half-assed, to be honest. I think it, like, realistically looking at Mindbender or something, right? You get 4 seconds of CDR from Mind Blast and Penance only now. So you have very specific amount of cooldowns that you can have on the spell being in 4-second increments, right? And you really don't have a lot of options, to the point where I question why it even has to be tied to these spells. This is something we've also said in the past, that Void Summoner could just be an actual cooldown reduction talent where it just says these spells have reduced cooldown and that's it. Like, it could just say Mindbender's cooldown is reduced by 15 seconds, Shadow Fiend's cooldown is reduced by 90 seconds, and then Void Wraith have it be reduced with Shadow Fiend by 60 seconds, something like that. And you could, it's the same end result now anyway. Before, if all you did was smiting, you could get some insane amount of CDR. We've seen this a lot, especially with the old tier set, and on Smolderon or something, you could get a lot of CDR for some fights. But now
Also, heavily this
there's
tier dungeons.
yeah,
There's a lot
yeah,
of these
that's true.
current dungeons that are being handled by people pushing Void Wraith to ridiculously low cooldowns.
Yep. And those things are they're just not possible anymore. So I question why it even has to be tied to Penance and Mind Blast at that point, because it just I don't think there's a need for it. I think for dungeons or something, you shouldn't have to like cast Penance out of combat just to get CDR or something either. I don't think it's really necessary, and it just makes it confusing for people, because that's the first question we get from everyone that looks at this town is like, okay, what does this actually mean? What is my pet cooldown? Because your average player can't translate what the Void Summoner reads into what the actual cooldown is. They don't know the actual cast per minute of the spells. They don't know the upper and lower bound of this.
Yeah, you mean the
And
average player doesn't have a table of all their cast
yeah,
CPMs in
like
front of them at all times?
it just it doesn't make sense to them, and I can't blame them. And I think at that point, just make it easier for everyone. If you don't want us to have pet every 30 seconds, then don't allow us to, and just make it easy. I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think their goal is just to keep the talent interesting and not just a complete passive. But I definitely can see some potential issues with it as well. Like I'm scared of of a situation where I have to press penance at a time where I otherwise wouldn't, like in the middle of a ramp, because that's needed in order to hit a certain pet interval cooldown.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know how realistic that is in a real situation, but it does open it up to like possibilities like that where these spells that you're not necessarily pressing strictly on cooldown, because I don't know, like Mind Blast, for example, is another thing where you don't necessarily want to press it every time it comes up because you might need it 5-10 seconds later, but now you might feel pressured to press it more often because you need it for the pet cooldown. It doesn't work well for
Yeah.
me.
I mean,
Yeah.
pressing Smite for CDR was like you press Smite only for the CDR, and you can always press Smite. It has no cooldown, but Mind Blast and Penance, those you want to actually use for moments. And I mean, very specifically, if a fight has 40-second timers, you need to press 5 CDR spells in that time, and that means you're gonna have to press 2 Mind Blasts and 3 Penances. Well, to press 2 Mind Blasts in 40 seconds, that needs to happen every 20 seconds. So if you have like early 30% haste, it has 18-second cooldown, you better be pressing that Mind Blast 2 seconds after it's ready, else you're not getting your pet. And that
Yeah.
does not sound cool. Maybe I'm
There,
doing something during that, sorry.
just an example as well from raid testing yesterday. We had our first raid testing on Friday, and disclaimer, this was being bad because I was testing Oracle, and I have not a lot of experience on Oracle because it's been atrocious on live. But I was doing a few polls as Oracle, and not used to the new pet changes. On live, there's been a handful of times where I finish my ramp, I mistime my pet a little bit, I've got like 2 seconds left of my pet cooldown. So all I do is I hit Evangelism, I Mind Blast, I throw in 1 extra smite to finish my pet, I throw my pet out, and I keep going. Is it a loss? Yes, I probably should have done that, I should have fixed it, but I had a way of resolving the issue. Yesterday during raid testing, I had multiple situations where, like you said, I needed to be pressing X number of CPM spells or X number of cooldown reducing spells to meet these CPM requirements that I failed to do. So I'm sitting there finishing my ramp, and my pet cooldown has not finished yet. And there was a couple times where, I'm sitting there playing Oracle, ready to send an insight to start chaining penances, but all of a sudden I need to penance to get my pet back up, and it just leads to this very random situation.
Yep.
It's not great. The previous issue of I can just sit there and spam smite to the point where smite outvalues a bunch of our other spells because our pet is the only thing that matters. Also not great. It's good that they fixed that. But I agree. I don't think this is a great solution from a usability perspective. It leads to a lot of random knowledge requirements of, general CPM and, being able to do this on the fly math of how many times you need to be doing something within a certain window to be able to get your pet to a certain cooldown. I'm already imagining in the guide for next tier, we're going to end up having a giant chart that says, so you want to get your pet cooldown to X, here's what you need to do.
Yeah, unironically, yeah.
And that's not literally that is going to be in the guide, and that's not good from a usability perspective.
I think we could easily do next year and have like only one fight where it actually becomes a problem, because when I was playing, I also tested Oracle yesterday, but I don't think I ran into the Shadow Fiend issue. But I think if there is a fight where it does become a problem, it'll be very apparent. And we might just roll a good tier and it doesn't, no one notices really that it's a problem in raids. But maybe the tier after that we will. And this feels more like a band-aid issue, a band-aid fix.
I also just want to go back to like the Viserio spreadsheet conversation for a second. Is like I know probably plenty of people already plan their Mind Blast cooldowns, but this is going to make it even more vital that you're remembering to press your Mind Blast X number of times. And I don't like that. Like I personally do not put Mind Blast into the sheet. I like to kind of muscle memory my mini ramps and have them be more flexible. But this makes it so like if you must press Mind Blast 2 times between pets or whatever, it feels a lot more restrictive and counter to their goal of reducing reliance on cooldowns.
There's also no catching back up because both spells have a set cooldown. Like Mind Blast is hasted, sure, but as I said, if you fall behind, there's nothing you can do. I'm sure if you guys played Disc on Overnext, like you use your first pet on the first AoE thingy, then you use it on the second eggs, and then on the third eggs, and then on the next canister thing again. I've definitely had scenarios where I've done the third canister, I'm looking at my pet, and the ramp is like 25 seconds away. I'm like, oh shit, my pet still has a minute cooldown.
Yep.
Not good, but I can salvage it. It's not good,
Yeah.
and I need to spam cast Smite, but I can salvage it.
Yeah, I've been slightly late on the second ingest because my third pet was slightly delayed, or I moved
Yeah.
too much, or whatever, and I had to sit there and
You
fix
can
it.
fix it.
Yep.
That's the gameplay that I actually really enjoyed about the old Void Summoner. Like I know a lot of people have problems with it, but for me, I liked that there was some skill expression in it. It wasn't necessarily great that it made Smite such high value compared to other spells, but I liked that I could always be kind of paying attention to my pet cooldown and know that I have direct influence over it. Like, okay, is this going to be ready that I can chill and I don't need to spam Smite? Am I behind? Do I need to catch up? Yeah, I can maybe just cast a few extra smites and then start my ramp a few seconds later. It won't be ideal, but at least I can salvage the situation, kind of thing. Where this new design, it feels more restrictive, and I personally like it less than what we currently have.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm much happier about it. Like you have no chance of fixing it again. If the cooldown time you want to hit is tight and you don't get it done at the start, there's no fixing it. That's how it is. Then you'll just have to do without pet or like have to do it after the next penance, but then you're already 2 CDR procs behind on the next ramp after that.
Yeah, so I definitely can foresee plenty of situations where we just have to ramp without the pet and accept that it's not going to do any healing because we don't have an option because we messed up earlier and there's nothing to be done about that.
So, kind of moving away from talking about the Void Summoner change and some of those other changes, let's talk about some of the changes in the tree that we feel are kind of just more straight up negatives. We kind of already mentioned the removal of Train of Thought. From a numerical perspective, it's not that big of a deal, but it does make the spec feel slower. A lot of people have been very used to spamming Smite a lot, pressing Smite a lot, just because it was a very high value button with Void Summoner and stuff like that, and as a result, getting on average a couple seconds. Do you think it's fair to say 2 second shorter cooldown on average?
Yeah, definitely 2 seconds at least. Yeah.
And with how impactful Penance is from a visual perspective, a flavor perspective, a feels perspective, it feels nice pressing Penance often with the spec. So while it may not be a huge numerical change, because on average Train of Thought was getting you like 1 extra Penance cast a minute, it feels worse. People people liked having the faster cadence.
You played it yesterday. Tell me you didn't like do your ramp, Mind Blast, Penance, and then Void Blast, and you're like, you're clicking Void Blast, and you're clicking Void Blast, and you're like, damn, it's been 12 seconds or something. How is Penance? How you're telling me it's only been 3 seconds? How is Penance not up yet? Like it.
Yeah, it
You're just looking at
feels
cooldown like,
slower.
how is it not up? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. I've been there. I mean, it kind of happens every time I don't play Train of Thought on live as well. It's something I get used to on the fights where I don't play it, and then when I do play it again, it's awkward. Like
Yeah.
I did Overnex and Kaiveza without Train, and I got used to it. Then I played Court with Train again, and then I didn't play it again on Queen, and it was kind of weird again. It's cooldown timings on that on your like core spells really get used to it, and not only Penance, Powered Shield during ramps as well. Like I don't know how it is for you guys. You probably have a weaker for Powered Shield as well. Like I'm moving along on the frames trying to apply atonements, and every 2 seconds I feel like I have to glance back at Powered Shield because I have no idea what the actual cooldown is. Because before I would know it's like every third atonement, but now I don't have a rotation. I'm just like perma clicking Renew and Penance at a Powered Shield at the same time, hoping I press it.
There
Yeah,
was
I
a,
agree. I've had that same feeling.
there was a non-insignificant number of times during raid testing yesterday where I was sitting there spamming renews, and I got to the where I thought the next shield should be, and hit the keybind and didn't apply atonement, and I'm sitting there like, why am I not applying atonement? What's going on? Is my game broken?
Yeah.
And it took me a
Yeah.
few seconds to kind of register in my head, oh, shield's not available yet. So yeah, it feels weird.
It's been so long, and I'm still not used to Renew being atonement. Honestly, it still feels weird. Like it still feels like an absolute nothing button.
Yeah. Bring back plea.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it would be very nice just to continue, just to maintain the cadence that people are used to. I don't think it would be that big of a buff, just straight up reducing the cooldown of those two spells to match what the expected cadence was with Train of Thought, just so that people don't feel like it's so much slower with the removal of Train of Thought. Because I understand why they removed it. They were removing any tie from Smite to pet cooldown. So Train of Thought kind of got shot on the way there. But I don't think it would be that much of a buff to just give a little bit of CDR to both spells baseline. And we looked at the numbers. It could either be just like a 2-second cooldown flat, or they could haste Penance cooldown. Hasting Penance cooldown would basically at like 30 to 40% haste, make it similar to what you would expect from Train of Thought. Under effects of like Bloodlust and PI, obviously it gets a little bit more insane. That would be a bigger pro compared to just some flat CDR. But it also comes with the negative of early expansion when you're low haste, and when gear hasn't scaled up a ton, it's going to be a little worse. So it's got situations where it's a little worse, a little better. I would be fine with them either hasting the CD or just taking a little bit off. But I don't think numerically either way it's that impactful. Right? Like I think it would be fine for them to do that to maintain this kind of existing cadence that the community knows based on Train of Thought.
Yeah, I agree. I think everyone knows, or like a lot of people think Train of Thought is a lot more powerful numerically than it is, but I think everyone agrees that it feels much better to play.
Yeah, for me, the only other thing I'd mention is that Penance is also a mobility spell that I often, if not always, use it as a like quick little reposition if I'm not exactly where I want to be during that channel. So having it less available means more time when we're having to plant our feet and just cast other spells, which sometimes doesn't matter, sometimes does, but it is definitely a little loss. But that being said, I also can see this being a change that we just think feels bad now, but we also forget about it in a few months when we're used to the new cadence of Penance versus Smite and Powered Shield versus Renew. It's one of those things where it feels bad when you lose it, but down the road, I don't think it's going to matter that much.
Yeah, I think once you're
That's
used to it, it'll be less obvious again.
So, big one that I want to talk about, taking place of Train of Thought. We've got Inner Focus.
Mm-hmm.
We also had a rework to DA. Aegis is now completely different. And we had a slight adjustment to Aegis of Wrath now being called Eternal Barrier and no longer having the decay, but a slightly weaker shield buff instead. So I just want to start off by talking about how do you guys feel having 3 points in the capstone area specifically tailored towards this shield slash spot heal version of disc in such a competitive part of the tree? Do you feel like it makes sense for those points to be there, or is it awkward with how competitive that part of the tree already is?
I think they're not build defining enough to be worth going into. I think when you pick all three of them, you've got yourself an idea, like an extra, like you've empowered your single target healing, your shielding a little bit, but not to the point where I'd say this is enough to make a build. And you give up too much of your general throughput via pet uptime or harsh discipline or even just like lenience or something, to the point where it's just numerically also not worth it.
Yeah, I think what they're going for here is it reminds me a little bit of our old talent Grace from Legion, where it was only taken for Mythic Plus, and what it did was buff all of your casts on people who currently have Atonement. So it's
Oh,
what's
that's
currently our mastery, but it used to be a very strong talent that basically made it possible to heal Mythic Plus because our Atonement wasn't strong enough at that time to handle stuff on its own. So I think what they're trying to do is like maybe seeing the fact that they're pulling back the power of the pet and therefore atonement healing a bit, and they're saying in order for you to get through these tough healing moments and perhaps like replace rapture as well with more spot healing capabilities, they're trying to make it so our consistent spot healing throughput is a bit better with these talents, but they're just not good enough to actually do that. So I don't see anybody taking them in their current form.
it's
But
it's it's funny because you just said the word consistent, which I would agree. The only problem is what they're doing is giving you crit chance.
Oh yeah, let's talk
right,
about the
yeah.
consistency problem.
That is the like in general. You're right. That's actually like if this was like increases mass or like increases healing done to targets with atonement, like actual how grace used to work and not affect atonement itself, but I don't know, give it 15, give it 20, give it 30%. You know what? That could actually make a build more so, I would agree. But because it's crit chance, first of all, it's always a weird thing where the more crit you have, the worse this talent becomes because it's additive with your crit chance, obviously. But also, think of it this way, when do you currently press flash heal in dungeons? It's when someone's taking heavy single target damage and you're really trying to keep this person alive. The last thing I need right now is to spin a lottery machine and hope that I get a crit to keep them alive from inner focus. And then DA just doubles down on that because it only does something when you crit. So, 20% increased crit, there's a good chance that in 3 casts you just don't get a crit. That's not unreasonable. 3 casts you don't get a crit. Great, you just spend 2 talent points that are supposed to help you in this scenario that did absolutely nothing.
Yeah, the old
Yeah, and
version
the
of
new
DA.
capstone, the new capstone isn't dependent on crit, but it's just very
Sure.
weak. So it doesn't really help that much either. It's like, great, my power word shield that I can only cast once every 6 seconds or whatever because Rapture is gone is slightly stronger. So I feel like that talent is just very pointless in its current state.
It could be
Especially
stronger,
the
yeah.
text that power word shield lasts longer. It's like who asked for that? Like who is that helping?
I
Like power word shield is never ever expiring on its own unless you used it wrong. So
think the only point I could have for that is that it works without tier set. Um, that gives extra healing on people with absorbs and like giving you more lead up time. But besides that, I agree. I've never thought, damn, I need more power shield duration.
yeah, it's very strange.
Yeah, the old version of DA, obviously for people that aren't aware, DA was changed from being any healing crit event providing a percentage of healing to being direct crit heals only. So it's not going to work off of atonement anymore. It's now only
Oh.
going to be on things like
I can
radiant
tell you, it's flash heal, radiance, powered life, defensive penance, defensive uppies, and evangelism for some reason.
and evangelism heal. Yeah. So the problem, the biggest problem that it comes down to this is, like Small was talking about with you can just go 2 or 3 casts even with the 20% crit amp and just not get a crit. The old DA kind of worked off of the whole law of large numbers concept, right? Like, yeah, it was also crit based, but a lot of people don't realize the sheer number of atonement events that happen in a minute. You're putting out thousands of atonement events very quickly.
Yeah,
So
just to throw a number in, you can think of like it's more than 1,000 a minute if you're just playing normally. If you're doing frequent ramps, you can probably get like 1.5 to 2,000 a minute.
yeah.
It is a lot.
So, the larger number of events, the more likely those number of events are going to line up with the expected outcome. So, when you have a few thousand atonement events, you're much more likely to get about 20% of them to crit than if you have 4. And with the new variation of Divine Aegis being entirely single target, direct healing focused, yeah, we press Radiance a decent amount, but that's still only, what, 5 CPM, 4 CPM on average. You know, defensive penances, sure, it's a great button, but how often are we pressing defensive penance? Maybe a couple times a minute for extreme situations.
Yeah.
Flash heals, maybe 1 a minute. Like, the vast majority of our healing is going to be Radiance and burst with atonement. So the number of events that can even interact with Inner Focus and Divine Aegis are so much less often that you're much more likely to have outliers where you're not meeting the expected outcome. It's not going to be unrealistic to go through a 3-minute window of combat, and in that 3-minute window of combat see a 5% crit rate, assuming you have low crit on your gear, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not unreasonable to see that. So you're suddenly turning around and asking people, spend 2 or 3 talent points in the most contested, most build defining, strongest part of your talent tree on some stuff where you just might not see value.
And they're on a side of the tree where you need to spend points previously to even get there. You
To
need to
even
go
get there,
either
yeah.
through New Purge the Wicked or through Borrowed Time, which neither currently are points that we necessarily will always take.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we ran into that when we were putting together some of the PTR builds where,
Yep.
we wanted Inner Focus just because of the fact that it's a good point for Oracle because it works off of the defensive twin sight bolts with castigation contrition. So
Yep.
there was some value there with its synergy between twin sight and contrition. But even then, it was tough getting to those points. We had to move stuff around of like, where can we get the borrowed time points, assuming a single target fight where we don't want the Purge the Wicked points. Where can we get these borrowed time points to even be able to get to it? So yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
I could see these maybe shining in some future where atonement actually is not as reliable in dungeons, kind of how it used to be, and we do rely on direct healing more, and therefore we want to stack crit instead of mastery, and therefore Divine Aegis becomes a little more reliable. But like in the current tuning of these talents and the current way that we play and how strong atonement is, I don't see them being used at all.
So what do you guys see as a solution to these? There's a couple different things that could happen. You could either take them out of the capstone area, make them less impactful, like, put them in a less impactful section of the tree so that you can pick them up in their occasional benefits, but not trying to be a build defining group of talents. Or you could redesign them how they worked a little bit to make them more consistent, remove the crit variance, make it just, a percentage increase on those single target. How would you fix the issue?
I think just a flat heal increase would be boring, right? If Inner Focus instead just read that those spells do 20% more healing, while numerically this would be better unless you have 0% crit, which no one has. I think that would just be boring. I think having the Eternal Barrier is already boring. It just reads 20% more powered shield healing. How boring is that? If the other one is also just like Flash Shield does 20% more healing, that's just not it. So I think there has to be some twist to it where it becomes better when this is the case, but I would have to think about what I would have as a scenario. Don't have anything on my mind right now.
Yeah, honestly, I think this is one of those cases where I've heard the advice given that you shouldn't tell developers what they should change something to, only what feels bad about what it currently is. And that's one of those situations here for me where I know that these are not good and I won't be using them, but I can't tell them what they should put there instead. It's just a tough situation because there's so many competitive points at the bottom of the tree that I don't want to drop that it's almost like I don't want them to put something good on the left side because I want to keep the other points instead situation. So it's just tricky. I don't know how they fix this, to be honest.
Okay. I think there's two primary things that I still want to talk about before we wrap this episode up, because we're hitting a little bit of a long run time here. So there's two primary things that I still want to talk about before we finish. The first thing that I want to talk about kind of ties into the viability of the second thing. So let's start with stacking modifiers on Penance, because they have stated that they want to put more power into the baseline kit, and Penance is a very significant part of our power. A lot of our power and a lot of our strength comes from Penance, whether it's the raw healing of the Penance itself, or it's the Wheel and Woe stacks we get from it, amping the next Void Blast, or amping our next shield for single target purposes. A lot of power is tied into casting Penance. We've got a lovely issue of these stacking modifiers where we've got a bunch of different modifiers increasing the power of Penance to an extreme degree. Small, I don't know if you want to talk about this primarily because you were looking at a lot of the numbers for this. You can take this away if you want.
Yeah.
But we talked about this for, I mean, you and I and Zelder sat there for 2 hours arguing about how to fix this. So, I mean, it's something we've talked about a lot. But if you want to talk about the numbers in a little bit more detail of why this is a problem.
Yeah. So to give some numbers on it, think of Penance just doing its regular damage, and then you think of all the stacking modifiers that you have. That, like, if you just cast a Penance, go to a dummy, cast it right now, and then compare that to everything that you can do. You can have Schism on the target, which is only 10%. All right. You can have Shadow Covenant up, which this is 35%. That's already more, but it also turns turns Penance into Dark Reprimand, which is another 20%. Now, because you pressed Mind Blast and applied Schism, you also have Power of the Dark Side from a Dark Indulgence, which gives you 50% increase to that. Your Penance is also not 3 bolts, but 4 bolts baseline from Castigation, but if you Radiance twice, that gives you 4 more bolts from Harsh Discipline, which that's a 100% increase. So suddenly, instead of Penance doing 100 damage, you're looking at Penance doing around 5 times that damage compared to a completely raw one, which is just absolutely nuts. Having a naked Penance do 1/5 of the damage of a fully buffed one is just way too much. And whilst things like Shadow Covenant and Schism are not limited to only one Penance, Power of the Dark Side and Harsh Discipline all get consumed on the first Penance, which, as Void Weaver, you don't really notice as much, right? The time your second Penance comes around, you're usually done with your healing window. But specifically, Oracle really notices this because while they have another amp being a 40%, which is always active, the 5 times multiplier still applies for them the same way. So in a piety ramp, or not piety ramp, in a ramp where you have insight, premonition of insight ready, you're going to cast Penance 4 times ideally. Your first one does 5 times as much damage as a naked Penance, and the penances following that big one are going to do 1/3 of it. So you're sending one big penance and then 3 penances afterwards that all do the same damage together added up as the first one, which feels just, it feels kind of weird. I feel like you're investing time, you're investing resources into pressing this strong spell, but you've actually already used all of its power on the very first use. So as Clan said, we've gone forward and backward on this for a bit, and the number we've come up in our head that we would kind of like to see is that any time you cast Penance, it can only be around 50% stronger than the next one. Like, I think Shadow Covenant, Schism are probably fine, but Power of the Dark Side and Harsh Discipline should not amount to a 3-time multiplier. It's way too much. And as he said, we've come up with multiple ideas. Nothing that made us perfectly happy, but something just has to happen about it. Be it increase the baseline bolts, or buff baseline penance damage and nerf Harsh Discipline, nerf Power of the Dark Side and buff baseline penance, something along those lines. I think the only thing we really agreed on is we kind of don't want Harsh Discipline to be nerfed, because one of the very cool things about penance is when it goes machine gun and you shoot a lot of bolts. I would always rather shoot 8 bolts that do 10 damage than 4 bolts that do 20 damage, even if it's the same result. It just looks cooler. So if I'd have to give up something, I would hope it's not the bolt.
Yeah, Harsh Discipline's also in a much more competitive part of the tree as well, right? Like it's harder. While Harsh Discipline's very good, it's not so insane that you can hit it with a heavy nerf and still expect us to take it, right? Like
if it's
we
just
don't-
half, then you don't ever pick it again. Like
yeah,
if
we
you
don't.
need
We don't want
Yeah.
it to be in a situation where suddenly the solution is just, oh, we're just not taking Harsh Discipline. There you go, problem solved. That's not a good solution. So likely it has to come down to a combination of hitting Power of the Dark Side. Power of the Dark Side being a 50% amp and up for every penance after you Mind Blast. Like it's a very, very strong node. But Blizzard has made it fairly obvious with the changes that they've made that they want to increase the viability of Oracle. They don't like the fact that Oracle's not getting touched at all. And with what you were mentioning specifically about the insight ramps or the insight windows, where you're sending penance after penance after penance, there needs to be more value in the baseline penance spell instead of just entirely the modifiers. This also helps with Oracle's viability outside of these premonition windows, where you have things like Twin Sight, which we'll talk about in a second. You've got your just large 40% modifier straight up, which would obviously be more impactful with a larger base spell. You've got a lot of stuff in the penance basket as Oracle that to increase the viability of Oracle. Oracle's biggest weakness is lack of throughput outside of cooldowns, because something like Voidweaver, while Voidweaver has the same problem, their cooldowns are up significantly more often because it's tied to Mind Blast being a 18 to 20 second cooldown. Putting more power into baseline penance increases the viability of Oracle significantly.
Yeah, agreed. So I think that's definitely something that just has to be looked at. It's just we've had different solutions or like different versions of this in the past, if I think back, because on one hand we had a legendary in Shadowlands which was called the Penitent one, which it was basically Harsh Discipline, but you only had a chance to get a Penitent one proc, and you could get up to 2 stacks, but they wouldn't consume on the first cast. So if you got 2 procs, which it was RNG, but if you got 2 procs, then your next penance and the penance after that was both 3 extra bolts. And then we also had a tier set that made it so whenever you cast Power Word Radiance, you also gain Power of the Dark Side, but you actually were able to get 2 stacks of Power of the Dark Side, which also did not consume at once, but rather on each consecutive cast. So instead of only being one penance, only having one strong penance, you actually ended up having 2 of them. Besides that, we also had a version of Harsh Discipline where casting Smite gave you penance, or gave you Harsh Discipline back. So you prepped it before the ramp. Everyone probably remembers having to press Smite 4 times before the ramp. Then you go into your ramp, press Penance once, and then you're just going to Smite 4 times again. And by the time Penance is back, you also have Harsh Discipline again. So these things weren't as one-sided, but it really is right now. You feel it quite a lot, how you do a ton of healing during Penance and your Void Blast after that as Void Weaver, and then afterwards you're just doing this little maintenance healing with your Void Blasts that are all the same.
So we kind of talked a little bit about why this needs to be fixed in regards to increasing the viability of Oracle. So let's talk about Oracle for a little bit, because there was a very good change in the addition of Twin Sight, but then there was also some other changes that have impacted Oracle, like the removal of Heaven's Wrath.
Yep.
So let's talk about what was good for Oracle and what is still preventing it from being insane. The good is obviously Twin Sight. So let's start talking about Twin Sight. Twin Sight is fantastic. This is
For
something
any-
that we originally saw as a potential tier set that didn't make it live. They were going to give it to us as a tier set. It didn't make it live. They changed it to a different tier set. It's great. You were going to start talking about it. Do you want to talk about it for a second?
Yeah, I mean, for those that aren't aware, Twin Sight makes it so when you shoot offensive penance, it does 3 defensive bolts, and when you shoot a defensive penance, it does 3 offensive bolts. When you shoot a defensive penance, the offensive bolts from Twin Sight trigger atonement, and when you cast offensive penance, the defensive bolts trigger contrition. To have those out of the way, so they both, regardless of what you do, they both do the opposite counterpart quite well. It's always 3 bolts. It doesn't get increased by castigation or harsh disc. It does not work with scoff. It works with scoff actually. Contrition does not work with scoff. The rest does. The bolts turn into like shadow bolts with scoff. And it all works with Power of the Dark Side as well. So there's a lot of interaction with it. And realistically, what happens is you don't really play it much different, but it's a fun flavor added on top of how Oracle already has stronger penance, right? Oracle has 40% stronger penance, which is quite a bit. But now every time they shoot offensive penance, they also get this little defensive one, which, in dungeons you get a lot of healing from the defensive bolts, and in raids you actually get a decent bit of healing from contrition for free. So that's something that just kind of gives Oracle extra throughput, which is something it needed, but with a fun flavor in my eyes. This is better than just saying Oracle has 10% increased healing. That would just kind of be boring.
It's also just visually fun to fire off a penance and then watch some extra bolts jump to a target to heal them.
Yeah, and the way they implemented was just remove the talent that gave you 2 premonition charges, because realistically that node added nothing. You always had it. I think those nodes on the tree, or like on hero trees, are just complete nonsense.
Yeah, and to be clear, they baked that in default. We didn't just lose the second charge; they made it default, which is good. So that made room for an extra throughput focused point instead of having to waste one of the very limited nodes on the hero tree to give us that baseline functionality.
Mm-hmm. And also, it gives Wheel and Woe stacks. So Wheel and Woe, which was already it was insanely good for Voidweaver and alright for Oracle. Now it's also pretty good for Oracle because every penance, regardless of Radiance, is 7 stacks of Wheel and Woe, which does make Smite actually do some healing.
Yeah, I think those are all really positive changes, and I agree that like the visual aspect of it is nice too. That's one thing that I felt, even like ignoring the power aspect, like Voidweaver is just so visually impressive. Like it's one of the best hero talent trees in the game, in my opinion, for pure flavor and like class fantasy, and that's something that Oracle is definitely lacking before, because Premonition itself just doesn't really have much going on visually, and all you really get is the permanent little glowing thing on your forehead, which I think is kind of dumb, frankly. But but now, like I really like the extra penance bolts to the degree where I wouldn't feel like, man, I wish I was playing Voidweaver right now as much. Like if we do in some future end up playing Oracle, I think that the addition of Twin Sight alone has made me more accepting to that, because I think it's a really cool talent.
Yeah. We always said
calling those glowy eyes dumb is going to make you a lot of enemies. I'll just say that right now.
Okay, well, let me just
very defensive about their glowy eyes, to the point where I saw entire forum posts when the ability to switch to Drakthir came out, the glowing eye effect was not correctly centered, and the rage I saw about how that wasn't fixed instantly. You are
the
making
Oracle
some
community is not happy.
You are making some enemies right now, so choose
okay.
your
Well,
words carefully.
let me maybe amend that and say I wish that there was a way to toggle it, because it just doesn't go with every transmog. You guys know I am definitely into, like, I raid on an RP realm, if that says anything. Like, I love transmog, I love the visual aspects of my character, all that. But a glowing golden eye just doesn't go with everything. So I wish there was a way to turn it off while playing
Do you have a
Oracle.
Mario transmog?
I don't, but I should.
Transmog, man.
I don't know, like transmog. I'm currently playing Drakthir. I switched to Drakthir because of Queen Ansarek, and I know I'm also kind of alone in this, but I actually really like how Drakthir look, and not in their Visage form. So suddenly Transmog has become a lot less important to me, perhaps, because if I'm just in my Drakthir form anyway, I'm not seeing it. But anyway,
Yeah.
all that aside, probably don't need to spend more time on it.
So
But yeah, I think
viability of
so-
Oracle. Oh, you want to say something
yeah, I
first?
mean it's a similar sentence. I think what we've always said is what Oracle needs is something that isn't just premonition. Like the premonitions, yeah, sure, they aren't like, maybe they could still be a bit stronger, but like we're outside of that, you just have nothing. It does nothing. None of the nodes really did anything. It's not good enough.
Yeah,
And
and
this is a consistent buff.
numerically, Oracle wasn't struggling in their premonition window. Like when
No,
you had
usually not.
Piety or Clairvoyance running, and you were doing these full ramps, it was fine. It was competing, whether it was ahead or behind Voidweaver. It was close enough that you would consider it viable in those windows. The problem has always been that it didn't do enough outside. So number one thing for increasing the viability of Oracle, give it power outside of premonition, which Twinsight did. Twinsight helps
Yep.
that a lot. Is it enough? Does it allow it to compete on a mini ramp outside of cooldown window with just a Mind Blast from Voidweaver? No, it's not enough. It probably needs more. That kind of goes into the we need more baseline penance power instead of it being built into the modifiers. So these twin sight bolts and the modifier from preventive measures is more impactful on a larger base spell. We need more power into baseline penance to kind of push it in that direction a little bit, but it's a good step.
Yeah. And so something I also want to add, just a FYI for the interaction. Contrition works the same way Atonement works, where if Atonement is if the damage spell crits, all your Atonements crit. For in Contrition, it's the same except the defensive Penance. So if your defensive Penance bolt crit, then all Contritions from that crit. Which is an interesting thing because Inner Focus gives defensive Penance crit, so Inner Focus indirectly makes Contrition also crit more. The only sad part is that Contrition does not also provide DA shielding, which would have been pretty nice for it actually, because Contrition, similarly to Atonement, has a lot of events at least, and it would have maybe played a bit into the tier set, maybe slightly. So I think if that interaction was in, it wouldn't like make Oracle broken in any way, but like that's probably another good 3% maybe HPS that it could just have, and it's a fun interaction. I don't see the problem with it.
Yeah.
Um,
Something else we've mentioned it a bunch in passing, but we haven't focused on it. The removal of Heaven's Wrath. The removal of Heaven's Wrath also hits Oracle viability.
Yeah.
Yes, it hits the viability of the spell, period, in general for both Voidweaver and Oracle, but I don't know if people are generally aware of this, but the 40% penance modifier on preventive measures does apply to uppies. So uppies does just have Oracle does just have a stronger version of uppies compared to Voidweaver. So losing access to Heaven's Wrath is a pretty big hit to Oracle, considering a significant percentage of their power was in that button. So we really, really, really need to see. I mean, we talked about how 4-minute cooldown was just awkward previously, but it's also, if Blizzard's intent is to increase the viability of Oracle, having a 4-minute cooldown uppies is not helping. Like, and I don't think it's that damning to have it be a 2-minute cooldown. 2 minutes on average was about where you could get it previously with the cooldown reduction. 2 to 2.5 minutes. There were fights where we pushed it to 2 intentionally because we wanted it, think like Naimu. We did it on a 2-minute cycle there, and it was fine. It was a little tight when we first started practicing it, but it was not a problem. Having it just be a 2-minute cooldown, I don't feel is that crazy, and just helps again with the viability of Oracle.
Yeah, I think maybe a good compromise could be to put Heaven's Wrath in the Oracle tree if they are afraid of Uppies being too powerful for Void Weaver specifically, but they want to focus on it being more of the main thing that Oracle does for Raid Burst. Like, I could see that maybe making me more inclined to give Oracle a try if the point of playing Oracle was to have more frequent and more powerful Uppies.
It is
Versus-
also, but Heaven's Wrath was based on Penance Bolt, and Oracle has a shit ton more bolts because Twin Sight, first of all, is 3 more bolts, and they can inside Penance as well. So if it was if it was baked into Overloaded with Light, you could nerf it to like less than 2 seconds and per bolt, and Oracle would still get more CDR than Void Weaver.
Yeah,
Void
that's
Weaver
true.
would probably be stuck at I'd have to get numbers right, but I think Oracle can probably get like 60-70% more CDR than Void Weaver can.
True.
So that's also an option if they it's already better for Oracle, but Void Weaver has it, and if they put it on Oracle tree, they have to come up with something for Holy as well.
Yeah, that's the hard part. They have to come up with a holy equivalent. What would you consider the holy equivalent to Uppies?
What did they get from Twinside? What is Twinside as Holy Priest?
I didn't even think to check.
Hold on, I'm looking right now. I have no idea. An additional 2 stacks of Prayer of Mending is placed on a second ally within 40 yards when casting Prayer of Mending.
Oh, that's right. I do remember seeing that.
Okay. That does not sound that epic when Archon... Wait, actually, no, you could... No, never mind. I thought Archon had Answered Prayers. Never mind, that's a regular talent. Okay, cool, more Apotheosis.
Yeah, it seems really solid for Holy too, but it's not as flashy as it is for Disc, obviously.
Well, anyways, I think everybody agrees Oracle still needs a little bit more of a push if it's going to be viable. So if Blizzard wants Oracle to be viable, that needs to be, looked at a little bit more. They've not quite gotten it there. But is there any topics you guys want to bring up quickly before we kind of close this out? I feel like we've talked about most of the major pain points, but I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity just in case there was something we hadn't covered that you wanted to talk about briefly.
All I'd really say as a closing statement, I guess, is that I'm still excited to play Discipline in 11.1. I didn't mention this before, but I had a quick I betrayed Discipline a little bit and I played Evoker for a while this tier, and I missed it so much that I ended up coming back, even though like Evoker was still strong after the nerfs. So I personally I feel like Disc is in a good place overall, despite all the criticisms we've had for its current state and upcoming changes. Like I still am positive on the spec as a whole and looking forward to continuing to play it in its current form.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd rather get kicked from another guild than play Holy, so...
Very true. Nobody can doubt your loyalty to the spec.
Right.
The man has been willing to get kicked out of guilds over it. All right, well, I think that basically covers everything then. I think this was overall a pretty good chat. Obviously, there will be more raid testing, more dungeon testing. We will likely see more changes. These changes generally don't just get, the initial changes with no follow-up. So I would likely assume we will see some sort of follow-up here in the coming weeks leading up to the patch. So we will continue to talk about those, obviously, in the Discord. So if you're interested in having a conversation with any of us about these changes, feel free to join us over in the Warcraft Priest Discord. But overall, I think we will go ahead and wrap this up here. Thank you so much for listening, and we will absolutely have more episodes in the future when there's more changes to talk about.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.